So those are all pretty serious struggles, and it's all rooted in the fact that jazz violin is deeply undervalued, disrespected, not given the time of day, because there are a lot of jazz violinists now, at least, who can play and can play well, and who should be, you know, side, a side person in various people's bands. People just don't think about using violin, right? So what we need to do, so that's why I think the education part is so important, right? Because if I'm fostering or helping, along with other people, the next generation of good, talented jazz violinists, hopefully we'll start kind of changing the perception, right? And it's already happening, kind of changing the perception of jazz violin. But for some reason, jazz is, of all the things that we kind of dabbled in, jazz was the one that really stuck. And she suggested to go out and get a Stefan Grappelli album. It was the Jazz in Paris with Oscar Peterson. I think that was my very first jazz record. And I was like, whoa,
Mm.
I can do this on the violin. That what's funny is most people think of Stefan as like with the gypsy jazz stuff, but that was not. That's the first time I heard Stefan. It was in this context with Oscar Peterson,
Wow.
and I was like, all right, I'm sold. Like this is what I want to do. This is really freaking cool, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and so that I mean, I just kind of took off. So then at that point, again, I mentioned my family is a very musical family. We still do a music school in New Jersey. We've got two locations, and so the lady I was taking lessons with, she was teaching there, so I was studying at our school. And we also have, a lot of jazz musicians, like horn players, teaching at the school, who are all like prominent Philly jazz musicians. And
Hmm.
this jazz rock fusion in the '70s in particular.
Yeah.
Um, but that idea that we talked about earlier of fusion, in terms of just fusing different types of music together, um, that it's hard to argue that violinists do it more than anyone else. However, given going back to what I said way earlier, that because of our very unique skill set and the amount of opportunities that we do have, generally speaking, we can bring a lot more into our music, and we have. Um, and so, maybe not Stuff or Giovannuti or Stefan Grappelli as much, but a lot of the more contemporary, like modern, like jazz violinists today, very much so, are bringing their like cultural background, right, um, into their jazz. But it's hard to make that argument because every jazz musician does that. You know what I mean? Like Regina grew up in Michigan playing in Detroit playing Motown. She has a lot of Motown influence in her playing. Yeah. So does anyone else who's from Detroit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I I I hesitate to kind of die on that hill or to make that argument. Um, but we certainly do take advantage of that. There's a lot of violinists that kind of fuse their kind of Americana bluegrass vibe with jazz. That's a big thing.
Hmm. And I know, you're a band leader for the Klezmer Fusion, Klezmer, I believe. Um, I also know, like, at least I'm Korean, and I know there's like Korean jazz in Korea where there's like distinct sounds. I've listened to a few albums actually recently about Korean fusion jazz, and they have a pretty unique sound themselves. It's kind of a mix of K-pop and some other things and
Yeah.
influences. I was just kind of wondering, like, as jazz is fusion, like, uh, I mean, ultimately, like, kind of what is jazz? I guess it's kind of starts the history lesson, but also, like, what's your take on and maybe experience with like cultural fusion, and like, how does that translate musically? Because, for me, I'm like a relative newcomer to all this, and just like hearing about, um, like, you know, as someone that's Jewish and with like Jewish music tradition and like putting that in, how does that translate? And yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting. So, yeah, I mean, the question of what is jazz is definitely a deeper and much longer discussion. Um, but look at the musical elements. That's what I do, right? So yeah, you can make a lot of arguments about culturally what jazz is, right, and the history of it. But there's also a lot of just hard, concrete factual evidence of like look at the elements of jazz, right? What do you need? What needs to be there for it to be considered jazz? What does jazz have? There's swing, right? But there's also lots of other grooves, you can say, right? There's a certain form to jazz repertoire, right? Like, I mean, there's different forms, but there's like a very specific type of form, just like there's in rock, there's different forms, right? In jazz, we don't have verses and choruses. We have A sections and bridges,
Yeah.
right? Or blues, rhythm changes, or those are different types of forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing happens in klezmer. There's different forms, right? There's different grooves. There's okay, so going back to jazz, there's very specific within forms. There's very specific different types of chord progressions, right? Not just 2-5-1s, but yeah, leading off of that, yeah, just like the way that jazz harmony works. That's a very specific. That's part of the jazz vocabulary, the jazz language, right? Speaking of the jazz language, right? The way you play, like bebop, is part of the jazz language, right? So like the way you would improvise,
Yeah.
right? That's part of jazz, which is a much different way that you would improvise in klezmer, for example, right? Or even Latin jazz. And it's related, but and then um, just improvisation in general, right? Like in a lot of other styles of music, there's improvisation, but it's different, right? So to me, there's almost this kind of looseness or freedom within jazz to express yourself through improvisation.
Yeah.
That of course exists in other music too, right? But that's a big element of jazz. So specifically, what I have done in terms of like fusing this music together is one of two things. I'll either take and I've done a lot more of one than the other. So mostly what I've done up until now is I'll take these Jewish melodies, um, whether they so just to be clear, klezmer is a specific type of Jewish music. It's like secular dance music. A lot of it can be kind of confused or misconstrued for like just Eastern European folk music because that's what it is. It's just folk music. It's dance music. It was played at, like weddings, bar mitzvahs, people playing on the streets. It's not religious at all,
Mm-hmm.
but it's obviously associated with us. Um, so I would either take klezmer melodies and the tunes, the chord progressions would be very easy. They're like 1-5-1. There's sometimes like a major section, right? Like not that there's no bridges, but like the middle section might go to major, the relative major key, or to the parallel major key, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it goes to the minor four, right? But they're very simple chord progressions. So one thing that I have done is taken a lot of those tunes, those melodies, and I would change the phrasing of the melody to either make them swing or fit into some kind of like Latin jazz thing, right?
Yeah.
And then I would reharmonize within that form, right? So I'm keeping the klezmer form, but I'm reharmonizing the chord structure to use more jazz harmony, essentially, to use like a jazz progression. And then in klezmer, there's no like open solo section. It's folk music. So the way you improvise is by like, bending a note or by like putting a little embellishment or a little grace note on a note. It's like, these little like it's just embellishments, these little like phrasings or interpretations, right?
Yeah.
But there's no like full blown like, okay, we're just gonna open up the A section to blow. No, that doesn't happen. So what's another element of jazz, like I said before? That idea of just like improvising on a form freely, right? So what I'm doing is I'm like keeping the integrity of the melody
Mm-hmm.
of these klezmer tunes, or like old like Yiddish folk songs or songs from like Yiddish theater, which are essentially the same thing as like a Broadway show, a Broadway tune. It's like the same music,
Mm-hmm.
just in another language, but same idea. So I take those forms, same melodies, right, and I would just kind of reharmonize them to fit jazz harmony, jazz chord progression, and I might change the groove to be, some kind of jazz feel, right? Open up the solos, open up the form with those new chord progressions for solos, and I would treat it like a jazz tune. So I'm kind of respecting a little bit of both of the song forms and putting and bringing them together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And then what I haven't done a whole lot of is the other way around, where I'll like take a jazz tune and like, you know, do like a klezmer thing on it. That'd be a little more challenging. I'm not. That's not really my goal. That's not really what I want to do. Um, but that'd be a similar process, I would imagine. Um, Personally, my goal with that is to get to the point where I'm writing my own tunes that use elements of both, like writing my own music, composing my own music, and I've done a little bit of it that uses elements of both those types of music. So like it might use jazz harmony, but I'm using like Eastern European scales because that's a big part of that sound, right? Or the grooves might be like actual klezmer grooves, but kind of fit into like this jazz context, right? And like open solos, and just like finding different ways to blend and still respect both types of music.